The hot Montana sun beat down on Asher Xavier's back as he drove the final fence post into the unyielding earth, sweat dripping from his brow despite the cool breeze of early autumn. His ranch was small compared to the cattle barrens spreading across the territory, but it was his every hard-earned acre of it. It was 1878, and the West was still wild enough to kill a man if he wasn't careful, but settled enough that a determined soul could carve out a life with enough grit and perseverance. At 28, Asher had both in spades, along with calloused hands and a back that ached from years of labor. He glanced toward the modest cabin nestled against a stand of pines, smoke curling from the chimney into the vast blue sky. For 6 months, he'd worked this land alone, but everything had changed 3 weeks ago when the stagecoach brought Pearl Lawson to the nearby town of Silverdale. Asher hadn't intended to hire help for the house. He'd managed well enough on his own, even if his biscuits were rock hard and his cabin perpetually disorganized. But when the town's general store owner mentioned a respectable young woman seeking employment as a housekeeper, something compelled him to consider it. Pearl had arrived with nothing but a small trunk and determined eyes that had seen too much sorrow for someone just 23. Her parents had died of fever back east, leaving her with no family and few options. She'd answered an advertisement in a Philadelphia newspaper, seeking a new life in Montana territory. "I don't need charity, Mr. Xavier," she had said during their first meeting at Silverdale's only cafe. "I need honest work, and I'm not afraid of it." There was something in the set of her jaw and the steady way she met his gaze that convinced him. He'd hired her on the spot room, board, and modest wages in exchange for keeping his house and preparing meals. Asher drove his shovel into the dirt and leaned against it, taking a moment to catch his breath. The sun was beginning its descent toward the jagged mountain peaks to the west. Soon it would be dark, and Pearl would have dinner waiting, just as she had every evening since her arrival. It had become a rhythm between them. He worked from dawn till dusk, and she waited with a hot meal and 2 clean plates. It was a simple arrangement, one that benefited them both, yet Asher couldn't deny that something had shifted in the atmosphere of his lonely ranch. The cabin no longer felt empty. It felt like a home. As he gathered his tools and loaded them onto his wagon, Asher found himself quickening his pace, eager to return to the warm light of the cabin windows. Pearl stood at the cookstove, stirring a pot of rabbit stew while keeping an eye on the cornbread browning in the oven. The small cabin had transformed under her care over the past weeks. Curtains now hung at the windows, fashioned from flour sacks she'd bleached and hemmed. The floor was swept clean, and wildflowers brightened the table where she'd set 2 plates, 2 cups, and the mismatched silverware she'd polished until it gleamed. She heard the wagon approaching and felt the familiar flutter in her stomach. It was foolish, she knew. Mr. Xavier Asher, as he'd insisted she call him after the first week, had been nothing but respectful. Their arrangement was purely professional. He needed someone to keep his house, and she needed a place to stay. Nothing more. Yet Pearl couldn't help but notice the way the corners of his eyes crinkled when he smiled, or how gentle his rough hands were when he passed her items at the dinner table. There was kindness in him, and a quiet strength that made her feel safe for the first time since her parents' passing. The door opened, bringing with it a gust of cool evening air and Asher's tall frame. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair in need of a trim, and offered her a tired smile. "Smells good in here," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Just rabbit stew and cornbread," Pearl replied. "Nothing fancy." After a day of fence mending, anything that isn't cold jerky seems fancy to me. He moved to the wash basin she'd prepared, rolling up his sleeves to reveal sun-browned forearms as he scrubbed the day's dirt from his hands and face. Pearl turned away, focusing on taking the cornbread from the oven. How did the work go today? Got the north pasture fence finished finally. Lost a good hour chasing down that ornery brown mare of mine, though. She seems to think the grass is greener wherever she's not supposed to be. Pearl laughed softly. Sounds like she has a mind of her own. That she does. He dried his hands on the towel she'd hung by the basin. Tomorrow I'll start on the west section where the creek runs through. That'll be the toughest part. I could help, Pearl offered, not for the first time. I'm not afraid of outdoor work. Asher shook his head. You do more than enough around here. Besides, fencing is back-breaking business. And cooking and cleaning isn't, she challenged. A teasing glint in her eye as she ladled stew into their bowls. He chuckled. You've got me there, Miss Lawson. They settled at the table, and Asher said a brief blessing over the food before they began to eat. Their conversation flowed easily, as it had from the beginning. Pearl told him about the letter she'd received from the general store owner's wife, offering her a position helping with the church's harvest festival preparations. You should go, Asher said. It would do you good to spend time with other folks in town. Are you trying to get rid of me, Mr. Xavier? She raised an eyebrow. Not at all. But I know life out here is isolated. A young woman like yourself should have more company than just an overworked rancher. Pearl studied him for a moment, noting the genuine concern in his eyes. I don't mind the quiet, she said softly. After everything that happened back east, the peace here is welcome. Asher nodded, understanding in his expression. He didn't press her for details about what she'd left behind. It was one of the things she appreciated most about him, his respect for her privacy. As they finished their meal, Pearl rose to clear the dishes. Asher stood to help, as he always did, despite her protests that it was her job. We both eat, we both clean, he'd said the first night, and it had become their custom. Their hands brushed as she passed him a plate, and Pearl felt warmth flood her cheeks. She quickly turned away, focusing on the task at hand. I mended your blue shirt, she said, changing the subject. The one with the tear along the shoulder seam. It's hanging in your room. Thank you. You didn't have to do that. It's part of why you hired me, isn't it? She reminded him. I suppose it is. Something in his tone made her glance up, and she found him watching her with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. He quickly looked away. I best check on the livestock before turning in. Nights are getting colder. Pearl nodded and watched as he donned his coat and hat before heading back into the darkness. She released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and pressed a hand to her chest, willing her heart to slow its racing. This wouldn't do at all. She couldn't afford to develop feelings for her employer. She needed this position, this security. Romantic notions would only complicate matters and potentially leave her alone again, something she couldn't bear to face. With determined movements, Pearl finished cleaning the kitchen and prepared things for breakfast the next morning. By the time Asher returned, she had retired to her small room off the kitchen, leaving only a lantern burning low on the table to light his way. The weeks passed, and autumn's golden touch gave way to winter's first breath. Snow dusted the mountains, and mornings dawned with frost covering the grass. Asher worked ever harder to prepare the ranch for the harsh Montana winter ahead. Pearl settled into a routine, rising before him to stoke the fire and prepare breakfast, then spending her days keeping the cabin warm and organized while preparing hearty meals to sustain him through long hours of physical labor. Twice a week, weather permitting, Asher would take her into town for supplies and to attend church services. It was after one such Sunday service in early November that their careful dynamic began to shift. They had stayed for the community luncheon, and Pearl had been surrounded by the wives and daughters of neighboring ranchers and townspeople. Asher watched from across the church hall as she laughed with the women, her face animated in a way he rarely saw at the ranch. On the wagon ride home, she'd been unusually quiet. "Did you enjoy yourself today?" he asked, guiding the horses through a narrow pass. "I did," she replied, then hesitated. Mrs. Thompson asked if we were courting. Asher's hands tightened on the reins. "What did you tell her, the truth?" "That I'm your housekeeper." Her voice was carefully neutral. She seemed surprised by our arrangement. "People talk," Asher said gruffly. "It's what they do when they've got nothing better to occupy their minds." Pearl nodded, adjusting her shawl against the cold wind. She meant no harm. "I think she was concerned for my reputation." "Your reputation?" Asher frowned. "A young, unmarried woman living alone with a bachelor," Pearl explained. "It's not exactly conventional." Asher hadn't considered how their arrangement might appear to others. He'd been so grateful for her help, for the way she'd transformed his solitary existence into something brighter, that he hadn't thought about propriety. "I didn't mean to put you in an uncomfortable position," he said finally. "If you'd prefer to find other arrangements—" "No," Pearl interrupted, then more softly. "No, that's not what I want." Their eyes met briefly before both looked away. The rest of the ride passed in silence, but something had been acknowledged between them, even if neither was ready to give it voice. That evening, as they sat before the fire after dinner, Asher cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about what you said about helping with the outdoor work." Pearl looked up from her mending, surprised. "And?" "I could use some help with the horses. Winter's coming and I need to make sure we've got enough feed stored. If you're still interested." Her face brightened. "I'd like that very much." The next morning, Pearl rose even earlier than usual, donning her warmest dress with a heavy shawl. She prepared a heartier breakfast than normal: flapjacks, bacon, and strong coffee, knowing they would both need the energy for the day ahead. Asher seemed surprised when he entered the kitchen to find her dressed for outdoor work. "You're serious about helping, aren't you?" "I told you, I'm not afraid of work," she replied, setting his plate before him. "My father owned a small farm before we lost it. I know my way around animals." After breakfast, they headed to the barn together. The sky was clear, promising a cold but sunny day. Asher showed her how he wanted the hay distributed and which horses needed extra attention due to age or temperament. Pearl worked steadily, moving from stall to stall. She had a natural way with the animals, speaking softly to them as she brushed their coats or checked their hooves. Asher found himself watching her more often than focusing on his own tasks. There was something captivating about the way she moved, efficient but gentle, confident in her abilities. "You're good with them," he said when she successfully calmed his most skittish mare. "Most folks can't get near Willow without her throwing a fit." Pearl smiled, stroking the horse's neck. "She just needs patience. Animals know when you're nervous or when you don't have time for them." "Is that so?" Asher leaned against the stall door. "What else do they know?" "They know kindness," she said simply, meeting his gaze. "Just like people do." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of what had been building since her arrival. Asher straightened, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "We should check the feed stores," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Make sure we've got enough to last through winter." Pearl nodded, understanding his retreat. This was new territory for both of them, and neither seemed quite ready to chart its course. As the day progressed, they fell into a comfortable rhythm, working side by side. Asher found himself sharing stories of how he'd come to Montana 5 years earlier, leaving behind a failing family business in St. Louis to seek his fortune in the West. "I had no idea what I was doing," he admitted as they stacked hay bales. "First winter nearly killed me." Would have if not for old Jim Harker taking pity on this city boy and showing me the ropes. What happened to him? Pearl asked. Moved on to California last spring. Said his bones couldn't take another Montana winter. Asher smiled at the memory. Good man. Taught me everything I know about ranching. You've done well for yourself, Pearl observed, looking around at the modest but well-maintained property. It's a start, Asher said. One day I hope to have a real cattle operation going, maybe even build a proper house. The cabin is lovely, Pearl protested. It's small. Fine for a bachelor, but… He trailed off, not finishing the thought. They worked until the sun began to set, completing more than Asher had expected. As they walked back to the cabin together, Pearl's cheeks were flushed from the cold and exertion, her eyes bright with accomplishment. Thank you for your help today, Asher said as they reached the porch. You've saved me a good day's work. I enjoyed it, Pearl replied honestly. It felt good to be outside, to be useful in a different way. You're always useful, he said quickly, then awkwardly added, I mean, I appreciate everything you do, inside and outside the house. Pearl smiled. Thank you. That night at dinner, their conversation flowed more freely than ever before. The shared work had broken down some invisible barrier between them, allowing a new level of comfort to develop. As winter settled fully over the Montana landscape, their days fell into a new pattern. Mornings and evenings were spent in the warmth of the cabin, with Pearl tending to household matters while Asher handled the necessary ranch chores. But several afternoons a week, they would work together mending tack, caring for the animals, or preparing for the spring planting. Pearl found herself looking forward to these shared tasks more than anything else. There was something intimate about working alongside Asher, learning the rhythm of his movements, anticipating his needs before he voiced them. December brought heavy snows that isolated the ranch for days at a time. Unable to travel into town, they spent long evenings by the fire. Asher taught Pearl to play checkers, and she read aloud from the few books she'd brought with her from Philadelphia. It was during one such snowbound evening that Asher finally asked about her life before Montana. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, he added quickly, seeing her hesitation. Pearl set aside her sewing. It's not that I don't want to, it's just difficult to talk about. I understand, Asher said gently. She took a deep breath. My parents died within a week of each other. Typhoid fever swept through our neighborhood in Philadelphia. I nursed them both, but… She paused, blinking back tears. Afterward, I discovered my father had been in debt. The small farm he owned outside the city was taken, along with our home. I had distant relatives who offered to take me in, but only as an unpaid servant. I decided I would rather make my own way. Asher's expression was one of profound sympathy. That took courage, or desperation, Pearl said with a sad smile. When I saw the advertisement seeking housekeepers for the Western Territories, it seemed like providence, a chance to start fresh where no one knew me or pitied me. And now, do you regret coming here? Pearl looked around the cabin, at the fire crackling in the hearth, at the man sitting across from her, his eyes filled with concern and something warmer that made her heart beat faster. No, she said softly. I don't regret it at all. Christmas approached, bringing with it a brief thaw that allowed them to make the journey into Silverdale for supplies and to attend the church's Christmas service. Pearl had saved a small portion of her wages to purchase gifts, a new hunting knife for Asher, and some penny candies for the children in town. What she didn't expect was to find a package waiting for her when they returned to the cabin on Christmas Eve. What's this? She asked as Asher handed her a carefully wrapped parcel. Open it and see, he replied, a rare hint of nervousness in his voice. Pearl carefully untied the string and unwrapped the brown paper to reveal a beautiful wool shawl in deep blue, embroidered with delicate silver threads. "Asher," she breathed, running her fingers over the fine material. "It's beautiful. I asked Mrs. Thompson to help me choose it when I was in town last month," he explained. "Your old one is getting thin and winters here are harsh." "Thank you," she said, meeting his gaze. "I have something for you too." She retrieved a small package from her room and handed it to him. Inside was the hunting knife she'd purchased, along with a leather sheath she'd made herself, carefully tooled with his initials. Asher examined the craftsmanship with appreciation. "You made this?" Pearl nodded. "Mrs. Peterson at the general store let me use her tools. Do you like it?" "It's the finest gift I've ever received," he said sincerely. Their eyes held for a long moment, and Pearl felt the air between them change, charged with unspoken feelings. Asher took a step toward her, then seemed to think better of it. "I should check on the livestock," he said abruptly. "Make sure they're settled for the night." Pearl watched him go, wrapping the new shawl around her shoulders and wondering if he felt the same pull that she did, the increasing difficulty of maintaining the professional boundaries of their arrangement. That night, after Asher had retired to his room, Pearl sat by the dying fire, thinking about the path her life had taken. 6 months ago, she'd been alone and afraid, facing an uncertain future. Now she had a home, purpose, and growing feelings for a man who had shown her nothing but respect and kindness. But was it enough? Could she spend years as Asher Xavier's housekeeper, setting 2 plates at his table each night, knowing there would always be this unacknowledged current between them? The thought left a hollow ache in her chest. January brought the harshest weather of the winter. For nearly 2 weeks, they were completely snowbound, unable to venture further than the barn. The forced proximity only intensified the growing tension between them. They were careful to maintain propriety. Pearl always retired to her room early, and Asher was unfailingly respectful in his manner toward her. Yet there were moments when their hands would touch passing a cup of coffee, or their eyes would meet across the dinner table, and the air would seem to crackle between them. It was during this period of isolation that disaster struck. Asher had gone to check on a section of the barn roof that had been sagging under the weight of accumulated snow. Pearl was in the cabin, preparing lunch, when she heard a tremendous crash followed by a shout of pain. She ran outside without stopping for her coat, plunging through the snow toward the barn. Inside, she found Asher pinned beneath a fallen support beam, his face contorted in pain. "Don't move," she ordered, quickly assessing the situation. The beam had trapped his right leg but hadn't fallen with enough force to crush it completely. "Pearl," he gasped, "be careful, the whole section might come down." She ignored his warning, examining how the beam was positioned. "I need to get something to lever this up. Can you hold on?" He nodded grimly, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. Pearl ran to the tool area, returning with a sturdy iron bar. With careful movements, she positioned it under the beam. "When I lift, you need to pull yourself free," she instructed. "Are you ready?" Asher nodded, bracing himself with his arms. Pearl threw her weight against the bar, muscles straining with the effort. The beam lifted just enough for Asher to drag himself clear before she had to let it drop again. Immediately, she was at his side, examining his leg. It was badly bruised and swollen, but miraculously, didn't appear to be broken. "We need to get you to the cabin," she said, already positioning herself to help him stand. Asher grunted in pain as he put his arm around her shoulders. Together, they managed to make their way through the snow to the cabin, where Pearl helped him onto his bed. "Your coat," he said through gritted teeth, noticing for the first time that she'd run out without it. "Pearl, you'll catch your death." "I'm fine," she insisted, though she was shivering. "Let me tend to your leg." She worked efficiently, cutting away his pant leg to better see the injury, then cleaning and wrapping it with strips of clean cloth. The bruising was extensive and the swelling concerning. "We need to keep it elevated," she said. "And cold compresses might help with the swelling." Asher watched her work, his expression a mixture of pain and something else, admiration, perhaps, or wonder. "You saved me out there," he said quietly. "You would have done the same for me," she replied, not meeting his eyes as she arranged pillows under his injured leg. "Pearl." He caught her wrist gently, forcing her to look at him. "Thank you." The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. "You should rest," she said softly, pulling away. "I'll bring you some tea with willow bark for the pain." For the next several days, Pearl tended to Asher and took on all the ranch chores herself. She trudged through deep snow to care for the livestock, chopped wood for the fire, and still managed to keep the cabin warm and prepare meals. Asher protested that she was doing too much, but Pearl was determined. "You hired me to help," she reminded him. "This is me helping." By the end of the week, the swelling in his leg had reduced enough that he could move around the cabin with the aid of a makeshift crutch, though Pearl insisted he continue to rest as much as possible. One evening, as she returned from tending to the animals, Asher was waiting for her at the table. He'd managed to prepare a simple meal: bread, cheese, and some of the preserved fruit from last summer's harvest. "You didn't have to do this," Pearl said, surprised. "You've been doing everything. It was the least I could do." He gestured for her to sit. "Besides, I was going stir-crazy just lying there." They ate together, and for the first time in days, Pearl allowed herself to relax. The strain of managing everything alone had taken its toll, though she'd been careful not to let Asher see it. "You're exhausted," he observed, studying her face in the lamplight. "I'm fine," she insisted. "No, you're not. You've been running yourself ragged taking care of me and the ranch." "It's my job," Pearl said simply. Asher shook his head. "It's more than that, and you know it." The statement hung in the air between them, acknowledging what they'd both been careful not to address directly. "What are you saying, Asher?" Pearl asked quietly. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I'm saying that watching you these past days, seeing your strength, your determination has made me realize something I think I've known for months now." Pearl's heart pounded in her chest. "And what's that?" "That I don't want you to be my housekeeper anymore." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "I want you to be my wife." Pearl drew in a sharp breath. "Asher, I know it might seem sudden," he continued quickly, "but nothing about this feels hasty to me. Every morning when I leave this cabin, knowing you'll be here when I return with a meal waiting and this place feeling like a home, it's more than I ever thought I'd have. And every evening when I come back, seeing you at the table with those 2 plates set out. Pearl, I want that for the rest of my life." Tears filled her eyes. "Are you certain? Once the snow melts, you could find someone better suited." "There is no one better suited," he interrupted firmly. "Not for me. I love you, Pearl Lawson. I think I have since the day you stood in that cafe and told me you weren't afraid of hard work." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been fighting it, telling myself it was foolish, that you only saw me as your housekeeper." "Never," Asher said, bringing her hand to his lips and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "From the beginning, you've been so much more." The weather broke in early February, allowing them to make the journey into town. Asher's leg had healed well enough for him to ride, though Pearl insisted on driving the wagon herself, unwilling to risk any setback in his recovery. They were married in the small church in Silverdale, with the townsfolk who had come to know them serving as witnesses. Mrs. Thompson had helped Pearl fashion a simple wedding dress from cream-colored fabric ordered specially from Helena, and Asher wore his Sunday best, standing tall and proud despite the slight limp that remained from his injury. The spring of 1879 brought new beginnings to the Xavier Ranch. With the money Asher had been saving, they began construction on a larger home, nothing extravagant, but with enough rooms for the family they both hoped to have. Pearl planted a vegetable garden twice the size of the previous years and began raising chickens, selling the excess eggs and produce in town for additional income. Asher expanded his herd, purchasing several quality cattle with the aim of building a respectable ranching operation. They worked side by side, from dawn till dusk most days, sharing both the labor and the rewards of their efforts. And each evening, no matter how exhausted they might be, they made time to sit together at the table Pearl had so carefully set when she first arrived, now with 2 plates that symbolized not an employment arrangement, but a partnership built on love, respect, and shared dreams. On their first anniversary, as they sat before the fire in their newly completed home, Asher presented Pearl with a small wooden box. "What's this?" she asked, taking it from him. "Open it," he urged, a smile playing at his lips. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, was a delicate silver locket. Pearl gasped as she lifted it out, opening it to find a tiny portrait of the 2 of them that had been taken in town the previous month. "It's beautiful," she breathed as Asher fastened it around her neck. "Not as beautiful as you," he said, kissing her softly. "Or the news you gave me this morning." Pearl's hand drifted to her still flat stomach where their first child was growing. "I still can hardly believe it myself." "Believe it," Asher said, drawing her close. "This is just the beginning." As the fire crackled and night settled over the Montana landscape, Pearl reflected on the journey that had brought her here from a grief-stricken young woman with nothing but determination and hope, to a wife and soon-to-be mother with a home and future more fulfilling than she could have imagined. And it had all begun with a simple arrangement. He worked from dawn till dusk, and she waited with a hot meal and 2 clean plates. But what had grown between those quiet dinners was something neither of them had expected to find in this wild, beautiful land, a love strong enough to build a life upon, one day at a time.